Hi, this is Rob Packard from Medical Device Academy. On October 10th and 11th, we're going to be giving a workshop in Amsterdam on 510K submissions. And this video is to describe one of the topics we're going to be covering. It's actually the first topic we're going to be covering. After my welcoming remarks, we're going to talk about converting a CE technical file to a 510K submission. For those of you that are interested, we're going to start the workshop at 9 a.m. on Wednesday, October 10th. You don't have to show up exactly at that time, but we're going to start out with welcoming remarks in this topic. And if you are unable to attend part of it, we'll be able to answer your questions. We're going to have a very small group at the workshop, and we'll be able to spend some private time with people during breakout sessions and breaks in between the speakers. Mary Votter and I will be the two speakers, and we'll have lots of time to answer specific questions that you have, either about your device or in general. This video, I'm going to cover some frequently asked questions to give you sort of a flavor of the topics that we're going to be covering. So the first question was, what is the difference between a 510K and a CE marking technical file? So essentially, these are both submissions for a regulatory body, but for CE marking submissions, there isn't yet a required format. There's an MD-Med preferred format. That's the MD-Med document that is a guidance provided by the notified bodies suggesting how your CE marking technical file would be organized, but it's not required to be organized that way. So you could organize it a different way. There's also a Global Harmonization Task Force guidance document. When the new MDR takes effect in 2020, we'll have an Annex 2 and Annex 3 that will specify this is what the content and format should be of your technical files. But a lot of the technical file is a summary document. So they'll have various summaries for the different testing, whereas the FDA is often looking for not summary reports, but full test reports. The FDA also has some different requirements for those tests. But for example, the only time that you would give a summary report typically to the FDA would be when you're submitting a special 510K rather than a traditional 510K. And that would be for minor device modifications. Other differences, a lot of things like the device description, you can reuse the same device description for both, but the FDA doesn't have risk classifications in the same way that the Europeans have risk classifications. Another difference is that you're required to have CE certificates, you're required to have ISO quality system certification, or have the equivalent demonstrating the procedures that you would have. There are certainly some differences in the procedural requirements. The labeling requirements for Europe, you have to have different languages. You don't have that in the US, it's US only. So there are subtle differences between the two different submissions, but essentially, the second half of the 510K submissions are the same test reports that you'd be using for your CE marking submission. So how do you determine what class your product is if you're already CE marked in Europe and you want to submit to the FDA as a 510K? If it's class 2A or class 2B in Europe, is it a class 2 in the US? It depends. And you can't use the risk classification that the Europeans use because that's a rule-based risk classification system, whereas the FDA has product classifications that are based on products that are very similar. So instead of having 18 of the old rules and 20-something of the new rules in the MDR, the FDA has more than 1,000 different product classifications grouped by different products, and some of those are class 2, some of those are class 3, some are class 1. But most of them are class 2, and they're not necessarily organized the way you might think they would be organized. And there are certainly exceptions where you'll find a device that's one classification in Europe and something completely different in the US. So you have to actually do a search for similar devices to yours in the product classification database. One of the examples on my website, I actually type in the word adhesive. And by typing in the word adhesive, you'll find a topical adhesive. Well, that's one product classification. And it's the rules that they have depend a lot on the indications for use. And although that might require additional testing in Europe, it usually doesn't shift the risk classification, whereas in the US, it will. Another question I get asked is, how do you determine the testing requirements? Well, if the product has a guidance document, so that product classification, let's say it's topical adhesives, has a guidance document, then it'll tell you what testing requirements are in there. Another way is when you type in the 3-letter product classification code into the database, it'll pull up a list of recognized standards that are related to that type of device. Another place that you can find it is when you click on the link for the product regulation number that applies to that product. It's usually beginning in an 800 number. So it might be 21 CFR 888 or something like that, or 880. When you click on that number, it'll take you to the regulation for that product. It'll describe the intended use for that type of product, describe that type of device, what it might be made of, and it'll indicate whether there are special controls that are specific to that device. So that's another place you can find testing requirements. If all else fails, then you have to go submission by submission through the database to look at what competitors have submitted for their products. In the end, the best approach is to actually ask for a pre-sub meeting with the FDA and submit a testing plan and get their feedback on it. And that's usually the approach that I recommend to all my clients. So another question, what testing can you reuse for your 510K? In theory, almost all of your testing should be reusable for the FDA, but there are differences between the US and Europe. For instance, the US currently has electrical safety testing edition 3.1 that they're recognizing, whereas the Europeans are still recognizing version 2. That changes in the near future. For EMC testing, the FDA recognizes version 3, and for home use products, version 4, whereas the Europeans are still on 3, and they won't require 4 until January 1st. So there are some transition differences depending on what regulation or what standard is being applied and what the date is of the implementation, and it changes from country to country. So you need to make sure that you're current with what the US requires. And sometimes I'll find companies will say, "Oh, we're all set. When we go to market our product in the US, we'll just submit what we did in Europe." But between the time that they had done the testing and the time they plan to market the product in the US, the standards will change. And so you have to be compliant with the version of standard that is recognized at the time of submission. Whereas in Europe, you have to be compliant on an ongoing basis and have to update your testing if the standards are updated. Another question, can a European company get 510K clearance first? Of course. You're not required to have CE marking or approval in your country, regardless of what country it is, in order to submit in the US. It's helpful to know, but not required. So you can submit just to the US and they'll decide whether it's approved in the US, regardless of what the status is in other countries. But you might want to it might actually be an advantage to your company to get clearance in the US for some reasons. For instance, with the new MDR requirements, there's a lot more emphasis on gathering clinical data specific to your product, not to a competitor's product, and they're not accepting a lot of literature review approaches for companies. So you really need to get that clinical data on your product. Well, it can also be post-market clinical follow-up studies, not just pre-market clinical studies. So you could get a 510K clearance first, just for the purposes of gathering post-market surveillance data, so you can submit it to the European notified body for your CE marking. And that would be one approach that you can use. It's not the only approach, but it's an approach that may be used more and more as we see companies trying to comply with the new MDR. What are the advantages of getting a 510K first, other than, of course, the one I just gave you? Well, one of the reasons is if you are a small company, you're a startup company, and you don't have a lot of money, you're not required to get ISO certified to do business in the US. So in Europe, you typically are going through the ISO certification process, or you have to be audited by a notified body to the MDR or the MDD currently. And that costs a lot of money. They charge a hefty fee. Whereas in the US, you're supposed to be compliant with the 21 CFR 820, the QSR, but the FDA doesn't actually come to do an inspection, and they don't charge for those inspections. So therefore, if you're tight on money, launching in the US first to get your clinical data might save you a couple of ways. One, it saves you the clinical study in Europe, but number two, it also helps you because you don't have to go through the ISO certification process before you can launch a product. So that's another example of ways that it might be advantageous to get a 510K first. There are other countries that also will accept the US approval just as readily as they will CE marking. So if your real goal is to sell in, let's say, Australia, there are mutual recognition agreements that may be very helpful. Getting approval for the 510K, depending on a transition date for a test, you might want to get it under the wire before a new standard takes effect. For instance, if you had EMC testing that's the old version and you didn't want to comply with the new version, you wanted to just get 510K clearance, you could submit now before January 1st, and that would save you. So there are quite a few little nuances that might help you if you were trying to get to market. You might want to go for the 510K first. But I see the post-market surveillance data collection being the biggest. Let's see here. I'm trying to think of other things that I wanted to discuss. I guess that's it for this particular topic. If you're interested in attending the workshop in Amsterdam, you can click on the link below. It's on the Medical Device Academy website, and the page is Amsterdam-510K-workshop. So click on that link, and you can register for the course. You can pay by credit card. It's $600 for both days, total cost. And then if you're interested in staying overnight in the hotel, you can contact the Doubletree Hotel in Amsterdam Central Station in order to get a room. It's right next door to the Central Station, so you can take a train in from the airport and then walk out the front door and take a left, and there you are at the hotel in Amsterdam. So we're looking forward to seeing you, and have a nice day.